1983, 40 miles off the coast of Baja California. A fishing vessel sitting in open water with its engine off. No wind, no moon, just the sound of lines shifting against the hull. Then the boat begins to move. Not with the current, not with the wind. Something beneath it is pushing, slow, controlled, deliberate, from directly below. Then the surface breaks. A dorsal fin rises out of the water, vertical, steady, standing taller than the man at the rail. It holds there for a moment, then slides back into the dark. If that were one story told once, it would be easy to dismiss. It is not one story. Reports like this stretch back over 200 years. Different people, different decades, fishermen, divers, coastal communities who have lived on these waters for generations, and the details, the size, the shape, the movement, the location do not change. Almost every account points to the same body of water. The Gulf of California, the Sea of Cortez, a place so extraordinarily rich in marine life that Jacques Cousteau called it the world's aquarium. A place that also drops to depths of over 14,000 feet, most of which has never been seen by human eyes. Long before any of these modern accounts, the Seri people, who have lived along these shores for centuries, had already given something in these waters a name. Not a general warning about the sea, a specific presence, tied to depth, tied to size, and that name has never gone away. When the witness descriptions are examined carefully, the shape that keeps appearing matches a known family of shark, the same family as the great white, only at a scale that should not be possible for anything alive in these waters today. So what is it? A misidentification repeated across centuries by people who know these waters better than almost anyone. Something science has not yet formally encountered, or something else entirely. Tonight, we go through what has been seen, what has been recorded, and what remains unresolved. But before we do, I'm curious, is this your first time here, or have you been down this rabbit hole with us before? Let me know in the comments. Now let's go back out there. Water defines the space before anything else can be understood. A long enclosed gulf, stretching between the rugged spine of Baja California and the Mexican mainland. A corridor of ocean nearly 700 miles in length that feels at once contained and immeasurable. From above it appears narrow, almost restrained. Yet beneath the surface, it opens into depth that resists easy imagination. A place where distance is not horizontal but vertical, dropping away into darkness that holds its own separate world. The boundaries give it shape, but the depth gives it meaning, and everything that follows begins with that simple imbalance between what can be seen and what remains concealed below. This gulf exists because the Earth itself is still in motion, its floor slowly pulling apart along the same restless system that forms the San Andreas Fault. The land here is young in geological terms, still adjusting, still shifting, as the crust stretches and fractures, allowing the basin to deepen over time. It is not a quiet environment beneath the surface, even when the water above appears still. The seafloor continues to open in increments too small to notice in a human lifetime, yet large enough to shape an entire ocean basin across ages, creating steep underwater slopes and sudden descents that fall away far more sharply than coastal waters are usually expected to do. At the northern reaches, the Gulf feels approachable, its waters shallow and warmed by constant sunlight, its ecosystems closely tied to the rhythms of fishing communities that have worked these areas for generations. Nets drop into familiar depths, and the seafloor lies within reach of ordinary equipment, a place where human activity overlaps easily with marine life. But as the Gulf extends southward, that familiarity fades. The bottom sinks away, first gradually, then with increasing severity, until it becomes a basin that descends to nearly 14,000 feet. The temperature falls with that descent, light disappears entirely, and pressure builds into a force that reshapes the conditions of existence itself. Between these extremes lies a quiet exchange that fuels the entire system. Cold, nutrient-rich water rises slowly from the depths, carrying with it the elements that sustain life near the surface. This upwelling feeds blooms of microscopic organisms, which in turn support vast populations of fish, which then draw in some of the largest animals on Earth. Blue whales move through these waters with steady purpose. Sperm whales dive beneath them into the darker layers below, and whale sharks glide near the surface, filtering the abundance that gathers in these productive zones. Sea lions cluster along the coasts, feeding where currents bring life within reach, their presence tied directly to the unseen processes rising from below. Above, the surface can feel full, active, almost crowded with movement. Below, the gulf becomes something else entirely. A thermocline forms a boundary between these worlds, a layer where temperature shifts abruptly, separating warm, illuminated water from a colder, denser environment that exists in near total darkness. Beneath that boundary, pressure intensifies and sound fades into something distant and muted, creating a region that few instruments have fully explored. It is not empty space, but it is a space that remains largely untouched, defined more by its inaccessibility than by what has been observed within it. The scale of this division shapes everything that lives here. Abundance gathers near the surface, drawn by the steady supply rising from below, while the deeper basin holds conditions that remain largely unmeasured, its volume vast and difficult to access. The Gulf, in its full structure, becomes a layered environment, one that supports both extraordinary visibility and profound obscurity at the same time. What can be seen is only a fraction of what exists, and what cannot be seen is defined not by absence, but by depth, pressure, and the simple fact that reaching it requires more than most efforts have yet provided. Long before charts traced these waters, or hulls crossed them under foreign flags, there were people who moved across the Gulf with a familiarity that did not come from measurement, but from memory carried across generations. Along the Sonoran coast lived the Seri people, who call themselves the Comcock, a community shaped by the rhythm of tides and the steady presence of the sea. Their world was not divided between land and water in the way later observers would describe it. The Gulf was not an unknown expanse to be mapped. It was a lived space, understood through repetition, attention, and necessity. They traveled in reed boats that rested lightly on the surface, moving through currents with an awareness refined over centuries. Each journey required precision, not only in navigation, but in recognition of what lived beneath them. Their survival depended on knowing which animals could be approached, which must be avoided, and which moved through the water in ways that signaled something unusual. This knowledge was not abstract. It was exact, built from observation repeated across lifetimes, passed carefully through language that preserved detail, rather than exaggeration. Within this framework, their understanding of marine life reached a level of specificity that would later be confirmed in unexpected ways. When modern marine biologists began comparing traditional ecological knowledge with scientific classification, they found correspondences that suggested careful, consistent observation rather than symbolic storytelling. Species distinctions aligned, behavioral patterns matched. The Gulf, as understood by the Comcock, was not a place of vague shapes and imagined forms. It was a system of identifiable animals, each with its own place, its own movement, its own boundaries. And within that system, there existed something that did not fit. Their oral tradition speaks of a presence distinct from all other known creatures in the Gulf, not described as a spirit or an abstraction, but as an animal with form and behavior. It was larger than the great fish they already knew, darker in coloration, and moving in a manner that set it apart from anything familiar. It did not resemble the broad, filtered movement of whale sharks, nor the faster, more direct motion associated with other large predators. It occupied its own category, one that required a separate name, because it could not be mistaken for anything else. The name they gave it translates roughly to the demon of deep water, though the meaning rests less in the word itself and more in its placement within their language. It was not a general term applied loosely to unknown dangers. It was a specific designation tied to particular regions of the Gulf, used with the same clarity as the names for other animals they encountered. There is no indication that it was intended as metaphor. It functioned as identification. This distinction matters quietly, but completely. The Comcock had no reason to blur categories. Their lives required clarity. Misidentifying an animal could lead to consequence, and over time, inaccuracies would have been corrected through direct experience. The persistence of this description suggests that it endured not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. This tradition existed long before any European presence in the region. It was not shaped by external narratives, nor influenced by later interpretations of the sea as a place of myth. It originated within a culture that depended on precision, developed independently, and remained stable across generations. When later accounts began to appear from distant observers, describing an animal of similar form, the overlap did not create the story. It revealed that the story had already been there. Across time, across languages, across entirely separate ways of knowing the same water, the description remains aligned. Not expanded, not transformed, but repeated with a quiet consistency that does not call attention to itself. It simply persists, carried forward by those who knew the Gulf before it was written about and who named what they encountered without needing to explain it beyond recognition. Ink settles into paper with a different kind of permanence than memory, and along the coast of the Gulf, that permanence begins to take shape in the journals of missionaries who arrived with a purpose that left little room for storytelling. Members of the Jesuit missionaries established small mission sites along the rugged edge of the peninsula during the late 1600s and early 1700s, recording their daily movements with a focus on survival, logistics, and communication. These were not collections of legend or folklore. They were working documents, written with the expectation that others would rely on them for practical understanding of an unfamiliar environment. Within those entries, among notes about water sources, travel routes, and interactions with local communities, appear references to warnings given by the people already living along the coast. The warnings are specific in tone, tied to particular stretches of water rather than to the sea as a whole, and they describe something large, dark, and associated with certain areas that required caution. The missionaries did not attempt to interpret or expand upon these descriptions. They recorded them as part of the operational knowledge of the region, placing them alongside other observations that could affect movement and safety. As the centuries moved forward and maritime activity increased, written records began to shift from missionary journals to more formal logs maintained by crews working these waters. By the late 1800s, a report appears within Mexican maritime documentation that stands apart for its physical detail. A commercial fishing vessel operating within the Gulf recorded an impact from below that carried enough force to damage the hull. The structure of the boat bore the mark of contact, not with submerged rock or known debris, but with something that moved. The damage was measured and noted with care. The origin of that force was not identified. In the early 20th century, these accounts begin to gather in a pattern that becomes clearer with repetition. Reports emerge from a consistent corridor along the Baja side of the Gulf, between Santa Rosalia and La Paz, an area already familiar from earlier traditions. The observations share a timing that remains steady across decades, occurring most often during the transition from day into night, when visibility fades and the surface grows quieter. The animal, when described, appears only briefly, rising into view before returning below, with no extended pursuit or visible agitation. Across these early records, one detail remains fixed with unusual clarity. The dorsal fin, described by witnesses who had no shared narrative framework, appears consistently as a rigid triangular structure extending above the water to a height comparable to that of a standing person. The proportion is repeated without variation, whether the account comes from a written log, a verbal report later transcribed, or a recollection preserved within a working crew. The shape does not shift over time. It does not grow more elaborate or take on exaggerated form. It remains the same, held steady across generations of observers who did not depend on one another for their descriptions. This continuity stands apart from the way stories typically change as they pass through different contexts. Accounts that originate in uncertainty often expand, borrowing details, adapting to new audiences, and accumulating elements that reflect imagination as much as observation. Here the opposite pattern emerges. The description narrows rather than expands, maintaining its structure with a precision that suggests repeated encounters with the same set of features rather than a narrative being reshaped. The written record, taken on its own, does not attempt to explain what was seen. It does not reach beyond the immediate experience of contact, movement, and form. It simply preserves the details as they were reported, placing them into a timeline that extends quietly across centuries. In that record, the animal does not change. The observers change. The language shifts. The context evolves. Yet the shape described on the water remains constant, held in place by repetition rather than by interpretation. If the accumulated accounts are placed side by side and reduced to their shared elements, a shape begins to form that does not depend on tone or interpretation, only on repetition. Individual voices fade into a single outline, built from details that remain stable, regardless of who is speaking. What emerges is not a story told for effect, but a set of observations that align closely enough to be treated as data, each description reinforcing the same structure from a slightly different angle. The first element is scale, described in relation to familiar objects rather than abstract measurement. Witnesses compare the length of the animal to the size of their vessels, to the distance between points they know well, producing estimates that fall into two overlapping bands. The lower range, between 20 and 30 feet, sits within the outer limits of known large sharks, occupying a space that does not immediately contradict established records. The upper range extends further, into lengths between 40 and 60 feet, where no confirmed living shark has been documented. These larger estimates appear less frequently, but they do not introduce new shapes or behaviors, only a greater extension of the same form. Color follows with unusual consistency. The animal is described as uniformly dark, often near black or deep gray, lacking the lighter underside associated with counter shading in many pelagic species. There is no contrast pattern noted, no shift in tone as it moves. The surface of the body appears as a single uninterrupted shade, absorbing light rather than reflecting it, a detail that remains unchanged across accounts separated by distance and time. The dorsal fin stands out as the most immediately recognizable feature. It rises sharply from the back, triangular and rigid, extending above the surface to a height repeatedly compared to that of a standing person. This proportion does not fluctuate. It is described with the same relative scale, whether the observer is close or at a distance, whether the encounter is brief or sustained. In known species, such as the great white shark, dorsal fins reach only a fraction of that height, rarely exceeding 2 feet above the water. The difference is not subtle. It is a defining characteristic that anchors the entire profile. Behind the body, the tail appears with equal clarity in the accounts that include it. Witnesses describe a crescent-shaped, symmetrical structure consistent with the caudal fin of lambdid sharks, the family that includes great whites and mako sharks. It is not the broad horizontal fluke of a whale, nor the elongated upper lobe of a thresher shark. The shape suggests a design built for sustained, powerful swimming, balanced and efficient, aligned with known patterns of large predatory fish. Movement at the surface remains controlled and deliberate. The animal does not surge or break the water with speed. It travels with a steady, measured motion, maintaining a consistent path unless it adjusts course gradually. Encounters often describe it circling vessels, not in rapid arcs, but in slow, wide loops that bring it near before it moves away again. This behavior aligns with investigatory patterns observed in known sharks, where unfamiliar objects are approached cautiously rather than attacked immediately. Across all recorded accounts, one absence becomes as significant as the details that are present. No witness describes seeing teeth. The descriptions do not focus on an open mouth or visible jaws. The attention remains fixed on size, shape, and proximity, on the quiet passage of something large, moving close enough to be measured by comparison alone. The impression comes not from aggression, but from scale, from the contrast between the animal and the small vessels observing it. When these descriptions are presented without context, stripped of their origin, marine biologists evaluating them independently have identified the profile as consistent with a lambdid shark. The body plan aligns, the tail structure fits, the movement corresponds to known behavior. Only the size remains unresolved, extending beyond the limits of any confirmed species, while maintaining the proportions of one that is already understood. There are moments when the pattern resolves into a single point, where the long accumulation of accounts narrows into one clear encounter, recorded with enough care to stand on its own. In the year 2008, a sport fishing captain named Jaime Rendon was operating out of La Paz, guiding a vessel through offshore water familiar to him through years of routine navigation. The conditions were unremarkable, the kind of steady setting in which experience replaces uncertainty, where distance and motion are read almost without conscious thought. At a point roughly 40 miles from shore, the encounter began not with sudden disturbance, but with the quiet recognition of something moving alongside the boat. The animal remained just below the surface, its outline visible through the shifting light, maintaining a position parallel to the hull. Rendon did not react with haste. His account, given later, reflects a deliberate attention to detail, the kind that comes from familiarity with scale in open water. Instead of relying on impression, he compared the length of the animal directly to the known dimensions of his vessel, using the boat itself as a reference point anchored in certainty. From that comparison, he estimated a length between 20 and 30 feet, a range that places the animal within the upper boundary of known large sharks, while still leaving room for uncertainty. The coloration appeared uniformly dark, without the lighter contrast often seen in pelagic species, and the movement remained steady, almost unhurried. For several minutes, the animal traveled alongside the vessel, neither accelerating nor retreating, maintaining a consistent distance as if observing rather than reacting. The encounter did not escalate. There was no abrupt change in direction, no visible aggression. After maintaining this parallel course, the animal gradually altered its depth, descending out of sight with the same controlled motion it had displayed at the surface. The water returned to its prior state, leaving only the memory of scale and proximity behind. Rendon reported the sighting to local maritime authorities, treating it as an observation rather than an isolated story. His account was later included in a broader effort to document similar encounters, where it drew attention not because it was unusual, but because it aligned so closely with others already collected. Jonathan Whitfield, who had been compiling structured testimonies from fishing crews operating in the same region, compared Rendon's report with additional accounts from that period. Within weeks of this sighting, 3 separate crews working in the same corridor described encounters with large, unidentified sharks displaying similar characteristics. The descriptions matched in scale, coloration, and behavior, and they occurred within a confined geographic range rather than being dispersed across the Gulf. This clustering is not isolated to that year alone. It appears repeatedly in the record, with sightings emerging in specific areas during specific intervals, suggesting a pattern shaped by conditions rather than chance. Whitfield's broader data set, assembled through structured interviews conducted over the early years of the 2000s, includes more than 30 accounts gathered with consistent methodology. Each testimony was recorded with attention to detail, separating observation from interpretation, allowing the descriptions to be compared without distortion. Across this collection, the same elements appear again and again, independent of the individuals providing them. What gives Rendon's encounter its weight is not only the clarity of his observation, but its position within this larger framework. It does not stand apart as an isolated event. It aligns, almost precisely, with the shape defined by other accounts, reinforcing a pattern that extends beyond a single moment. The same size range, the same dark form, the same measured movement near the surface, all appearing in the same waters among people who had no connection to one another beyond the routes they traveled. In this convergence, the distinction between anecdote and data begins to narrow. The individual story remains intact, but it is no longer alone. It becomes one point within a structure that repeats itself with quiet consistency, held together not by narrative, but by the persistence of the same details appearing where they are not expected to align. Patterns emerge most clearly when they are allowed to settle without interruption, when individual points are placed quietly into relation with one another until the shape they form becomes visible on its own. Across the collected accounts, locations repeat with a steadiness that suggests constraint rather than coincidence, as though the encounters are being guided by something fixed within the structure of the Gulf itself. The majority of sightings concentrate along a narrow corridor on the Baja side between Santa Rosalia and La Paz, an area that sits directly above the deepest portions of the southern basin. This alignment between observation and depth appears consistently, linking surface encounters to the unseen terrain far below. A secondary cluster forms near the mouth of the Gulf, where it opens outward into the Pacific, a region already known as a pathway for large pelagic sharks moving between broader ocean systems. The presence of these animals in that area follows established migratory behavior, and within that flow, occasional descriptions of an anomalous larger form appear, echoing the characteristics recorded elsewhere. These two zones, the deep southern corridor and the open boundary to the ocean beyond, account for the vast majority of credible reports. In contrast, the northern reaches of the Gulf remain largely absent from this pattern. Despite sustained fishing activity and regular human presence, reports from these shallower waters are nearly non-existent. The absence does not reflect a lack of observation. It reflects a difference in environment, where the seafloor rises closer to the surface and the conditions diverge from those found in the deeper basin. The distribution of sightings follows this transition with notable precision, appearing where depth increases and fading where it does not. Beneath each recorded encounter lies a consistent vertical context. High credibility reports tend to occur above water, where the seafloor drops beyond 3,000 feet, placing the observer over a column of water that extends far below immediate reach. This depth relationship does not appear incidental. It aligns closely with a phenomenon that unfolds nightly within these same regions, a vertical migration known as the deep scattering layer. In this process, vast communities of small marine organisms rise from midwater depths toward the surface under the cover of darkness, forming a dense, moving layer that shifts upward each evening and descends again before the return of daylight. This migration carries with it an immense concentration of biomass, creating a temporary interface between the deeper environment and the upper layers of the sea. Predators adapted to these conditions can follow this movement, ascending alongside their prey and approaching the surface during the same narrow window of time. In the Gulf, where productivity is sustained by the constant exchange between depth and surface, this nightly ascent becomes especially pronounced, forming a predictable pattern that repeats without interruption. The timing of reported encounters aligns closely with this cycle. Most observations occur between dusk and midnight, within the period when the scattering layer reaches its highest position. During these hours, the boundary between depths and surface becomes briefly permeable, allowing animals that spend most of their existence below to enter zones where they can be seen. The convergence of time and location remains consistent, with sightings appearing in the same regions and within the same interval across multiple years. Taken together, these elements form a structure that resists random distribution. The clustering of sightings within specific corridors, the absence from shallower regions, the correlation with depth, and the alignment with a known biological migration all suggest an underlying order shaped by environmental conditions. The accounts, when placed within this framework, follow a pattern that reflects the movement of an animal responding to its surroundings, rather than the scattered impressions of observers projecting meaning onto darkness. The Gulf, in this arrangement, becomes more than a backdrop. It acts as a guide, defining where and when such an animal would appear, shaping the encounters through its own internal processes. The consistency of this distribution does not expand outward into the entire body of water. It remains contained, repeating in the same places, at the same times, as though tracing a route that exists independently of those who happen to cross it. Depth becomes easier to understand when it is translated into something familiar, when distance is imagined not across the surface, but downward through water that grows heavier with every passing layer. In the southern basin of the Gulf, the seafloor lies nearly 14,000 feet below the surface, a vertical span equivalent to more than 2.5 miles. If structures like the Empire State Building were placed one above another, their combined height would still fall short of reaching the bottom, leaving a margin of distance that remains unfilled even by repetition. As descent begins, the character of the water shifts in stages that are not gradual so much as absolute. At around 1,000 feet, sunlight disappears entirely, not fading but ending, replaced by a darkness that does not vary with time of day or season. Below this threshold, vision depends on sources that originate within the water itself, faint emissions from organisms adapted to exist where light from above cannot reach. The surface becomes irrelevant here. its influence limited to distant pressure and temperature gradients that define the upper boundary of a separate environment. Further down, at depths approaching 3,000 feet, pressure builds to levels that reshape matter. The force exerted by the water column rises beyond 1,300 pounds per square inch, a constant weight pressing inward from all directions. Materials that hold their form at the surface compress under this load, and unprotected biological tissue would not endure it. The environment becomes not only dark, but physically restrictive, permitting survival only to organisms whose structures have evolved to withstand continuous compression. At the full depth of the basin, near 14,000 feet, the conditions intensify beyond ordinary comparison. Pressure exceeds 6,000 pounds per square inch, and temperature settles near the freezing point of seawater, held there by the absence of sunlight and the slow exchange of energy with the layers above. Sound, which travels efficiently through water at shallower levels, becomes diffuse and distant, attenuated by the density of the medium and the absence of surface disturbance. The seafloor exists in a state that is both stable and inaccessible, a place defined more by what cannot reach it than by what resides within it. Human observation has only partially extended into this space. Sonar mapping of the deeper sections remains incomplete, with large areas lacking the resolution necessary to identify moving objects against the complex contours of the seabed. The technology can outline the general structure of the basin, but it does not provide continuous coverage at the scale required to track individual animals. Deep sea trawling, limited by mechanical constraints, rarely descends beyond 6,000 feet, leaving the lower half of the basin physically unsampled. The volume of water below that threshold expands into billions of cubic meters, a three-dimensional expanse that remains largely unmeasured. Within this darkness, life persists in forms that generate their own illumination. Bioluminescent organisms drift and move through the water column, producing brief pulses of light through chemical reactions that serve communication, predation, or defense. These points of light do not fill the darkness, but they define it, creating a field of intermittent visibility where shapes can be perceived by contrast rather than direct illumination. In such an environment, a large animal with a uniformly dark body would not reflect light in the way surface species do. It would interrupt it, appearing as a moving absence against the scattered glow. When such an animal rises toward the upper layers, crossing the boundary where darkness gives way to faint surface light, it would carry with it the visual characteristics shaped by depth. The transition would be brief, a moment where the form becomes visible before descending again into conditions that conceal it completely. The gulf, in its full structure, provides the elements required for such concealment without requiring any deviation from known physical principles. Depth isolates, pressure restricts, darkness obscures, and the movement of prey between layers offers a reason for periodic ascent. In this context, the concept of hiding becomes less about intention and more about environment. The basin does not need to protect what moves within it. It simply exists in a way that makes observation difficult, allowing presence without detection across distances that remain largely beyond reach. Among all possible explanations, one rises quickly into focus because it already exists in both science and imagination, a name carried from deep time into modern thought. Otodus, megalodon, is understood as the largest shark that has ever lived, an apex predator of ancient oceans whose size extended into ranges that align, at least in part, with the upper estimates reported in modern accounts. Individuals are believed to have reached lengths between 50 and 67 feet, occupying a role at the top of marine food chains during the Miocene and Pliocene epochs. The scale alone creates an immediate point of connection, where the outline described in present observations seems to echo a form already known to have existed. This overlap in size is the foundation of the comparison. When an animal is described as exceeding the limits of known living species, the mind turns naturally to the largest example preserved in the fossil record. The resemblance, however, rests almost entirely on magnitude. Beyond that shared dimension, the evidence begins to narrow in ways that shift the explanation away from continuity and toward absence. Sharks, as a group, leave behind a particular kind of record. Their skeletons are composed of cartilage, which degrades rapidly and rarely persists over geological time. Their teeth, by contrast, are durable and constantly replaced throughout life, shed in large numbers and preserved in sediment layers across vast spans of time. In the case of megalodon, these teeth appear in extraordinary abundance within deposits dating to its known period of existence. They are found across multiple regions, embedded within layers that correspond to specific intervals of Earth history. Then, at a point approximately 3.6 million years ago, they cease entirely. No teeth of comparable size or structure appear in younger sediments, and none have been recovered from modern deep-sea trawling operations within the Gulf. The absence extends beyond the fossil record into the living ecosystem. Megalodon is understood to have preyed primarily on large baleen whales, animals whose size and energy content would have supported a predator of that scale. The Gulf today supports a population of such whales, including species that move through its waters in predictable patterns. If a predator of similar size were present, the evidence of its feeding would be visible in the remains of these animals. Carcasses would carry distinct bite marks, reflecting the structure and force associated with such a predator. No such patterns have been documented within this region. Behavioral data from living whales adds another layer of observation. Tagged individuals, tracked through the Gulf, do not exhibit avoidance patterns that would suggest the presence of a large, consistent predatory threat. Their movements align with known migratory and feeding behaviors, without deviation that would indicate pressure from an unseen apex predator operating at that scale. The absence of response does not prove absence of presence, but it does narrow the range of possibilities within which such a predator could exist undetected. Taken together, these lines of evidence form a consistent boundary. The fossil record does not extend into the present. The expected feeding traces do not appear. The behavior of known prey species remains unchanged. Each element, considered individually, might leave room for uncertainty. Combined, they establish a framework within which the continued existence of megalodon becomes increasingly unlikely. Yet removing this explanation does not resolve the larger question. The observations that led to its consideration remain intact, unchanged by the elimination of one possibility. The shape described across accounts does not dissolve when placed outside the context of a known extinct species. It remains, defined by its own consistency rather than by the name applied to it. What shifts is not the presence of the reports, but the set of explanations available to interpret them. With megalodon set aside, the focus returns to the Gulf itself, to the conditions that shape what can exist within it, and to the possibility that what is being observed belongs not to a distant past, but to a present that has not yet been fully understood. With the largest ancient predator set aside, the remaining explanations narrow into forms that exist within the present ocean, each carrying part of the observed pattern while leaving other parts unresolved. Marine biology approaches the problem not by searching for a single perfect match, but by testing known species against the collected descriptions, measuring where they align and where they begin to separate. The first candidate arises from familiarity, the presence of a species already confirmed within these waters. The great white shark is known to move through the Gulf, with individuals reaching lengths above 20 feet, placing them within the lower range of reported encounters. Their behavior includes circling objects of interest, approaching slowly before making contact or turning away, a pattern consistent with investigatory behavior rather than immediate predation. In open water, particularly under low light, human perception of size becomes unreliable. Without fixed reference points, distances compress and expand in ways that lead to consistent overestimation, a phenomenon documented in observational studies of marine environments. Within this framework, a large great white could account for many of the more conservative descriptions. The body plan aligns, the movement corresponds, and the presence of the species is established. Yet, the alignment begins to weaken when considering the details that remain stable across accounts. Great whites display a distinct coloration, with a lighter underside contrasting against a darker back, a pattern that aids in camouflage from both above and below. The uniform darkness described in multiple encounters does not fit this profile. The larger size estimates, extending well beyond confirmed limits, also remain unexplained within this interpretation. A second possibility draws from the largest fish known to exist in modern oceans. The whale shark appears seasonally within the Gulf, reaching lengths that overlap with the upper range of reported sizes. Their dorsal surfaces are dark, and their presence near the surface can create impressions of significant scale. At a distance, in low visibility, their mass could be perceived in ways that differ from their actual structure. However, the behavior of whale sharks diverges sharply from the patterns described in the accounts. As filter feeders, they move with a different purpose, traveling steadily as they consume plankton and small organisms. They do not circle vessels in slow, deliberate loops, nor do they make contact with boats in a way that would be interpreted as investigatory. Their head shape, broad and flattened, contrasts with the more tapered profile associated with predatory sharks. While they may explain isolated encounters where size and coloration align, the consistency of behavior described elsewhere does not fit within this model. The third candidate introduces a species that remains less familiar, yet aligns with several key aspects of the descriptions. The Greenland shark is a deep-dwelling predator, known for its near-black coloration and exceptionally slow, deliberate movement. Confirmed individuals reach lengths of approximately 24 feet, placing them within the lower reported range, and their behavior reflects a calm, unhurried presence that matches the manner in which the observed animal moves near the surface. One of the most striking aspects of this species is its lifespan. Radiocarbon analysis of eye lens proteins has revealed individuals living for more than 400 years, suggesting a growth pattern that extends across centuries. This extended development aligns with the concept of gradual size increase over long periods, offering a biological pathway toward larger individuals under the right conditions. The limitation lies in distribution. Greenland sharks are associated with cold northern waters, far from the warm surface conditions of the Gulf. Yet, at depth, the environment changes, with temperatures dropping to levels that resemble those found within their known range. There have been confirmed instances of this species appearing outside expected geographic boundaries, demonstrating a capacity for broader distribution than once assumed. Even so, no verified record places them within the Gulf itself. Each of these candidates accounts for part of the observed pattern, yet none encompass it fully. The great white explains familiarity, but not coloration or extreme size. The whale shark explains scale, but not behavior. The Greenland shark aligns with color and movement, yet remains unconfirmed within the region. The result is not a single answer, but a set of partial correspondences, each illuminating one aspect while leaving others in shadow, defining the limits of current understanding without closing the question. Cold water shapes certain animals in ways that feel almost detached from ordinary time, and among them, the Greenland shark stands apart with a presence that seems to move through the ocean without urgency. It inhabits depths where light does not reach and where temperature remains close to freezing, its body built for conditions that remain stable and unchanging. When considered alongside the collected descriptions, its features align with a quiet precision that draws attention not through novelty, but through familiarity. In confirmed observations, individuals of this species reach lengths of up to 24 feet, placing them among the largest carnivorous sharks alive. Their coloration is consistently dark, ranging from deep gray to near black, a surface that absorbs rather than reflects the limited light available in their environment. This uniform tone corresponds closely with the descriptions recorded across multiple encounters, where the animal appears as a single continuous shade without the contrasting patterns common in many pelagic species. Movement defines them as much as size or color. Greenland sharks travel with a pace that appears almost suspended, their motions slow and deliberate to a degree that once led researchers to question how they could function as predators. Early assumptions suggested that such limited speed would prevent effective hunting. Yet examinations of stomach contents revealed remains of animals that require strength and strategy to capture, including seals and even larger terrestrial mammals that had entered the water. The method by which they acquire such prey remains partially unresolved, but it demonstrates that slow movement does not equate to inactivity. Their biology extends beyond scale and behavior into a dimension that alters how their existence is perceived. Through radiocarbon analysis of proteins within the eye lens, tissue formed at birth and retained unchanged throughout life, scientists have determined that these sharks can live for more than 400 years. This lifespan places them beyond the temporal boundaries of most vertebrates, allowing a single individual to persist across centuries without significant change in form. An animal alive today could have begun its life long before the earliest written accounts from coastal observers, moving through the same waters, while human understanding of the region remained incomplete. This longevity introduces a continuity that aligns with the historical persistence of the descriptions. A species capable of living for such extended periods would not rely on rapid population turnover to maintain its presence. Individuals could remain within a given region for centuries, contributing to a pattern of observation that appears stable across generations. The overlap between biological lifespan and recorded encounters does not confirm presence, but it creates a framework in which such continuity becomes plausible. The primary limitation lies in distribution. Greenland sharks are most commonly associated with the cold waters of the North Atlantic and Arctic regions, environments that differ significantly from the warm surface conditions of the Gulf. Yet the deeper layers of the basin present a different context, one where temperature drops to levels that approach those found in their known range. Observations of this species have extended beyond expected geographic boundaries, with confirmed appearances in locations that suggest a broader tolerance for variation than once assumed. Within this possibility remains a gap that has yet to be addressed directly. Environmental DNA sampling, a method capable of detecting trace genetic material within water, has not been applied in a targeted way to search for this species in the deep regions of the Gulf. Without such investigation, the presence or absence of Greenland sharks in this environment remains untested. The question is not constrained by a lack of tools, but by the absence of focused inquiry. Among the candidates considered, this species aligns most closely with the collected descriptions in terms of form, coloration, and movement. It is not a hypothetical organism constructed to fit the data. It is a known animal, documented and studied, existing within the modern ocean. What remains uncertain is not whether such a creature can exist, but whether it occupies this particular body of water within depths that have yet to be fully observed. Recognition sometimes arrives long after presence, as if the ocean keeps certain forms in plain existence while knowledge trails behind, waiting for a moment of alignment between observation and attention. There are animals that have moved through the water for millions of years, known to local communities and hinted at in scattered accounts, yet absent from formal scientific acknowledgement until a single encounter shifts them into view. The record of these discoveries forms a quiet pattern, one that reframes how absence is interpreted. The coelacanth was once considered a closed chapter, a species placed firmly within the fossil record and understood to have disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous period. For millions of years, its existence was confined to stone, its form reconstructed from remains preserved in ancient sediment. Then, in the year 1938, a museum curator examining a catch from a South African fish market recognized something that did not belong to the present. The fish, still intact, matched the structure known only from fossils. Decades later, a second population was identified in Indonesian waters, confirming that the species had persisted unnoticed across vast stretches of time. A different example surfaced in the latter part of the 20th century, when a vessel associated with the United States Navy encountered an unfamiliar shark near Hawaii. The animal, later identified as the megamouth shark, measured over 15 feet in length and possessed a wide, open mouth adapted for filter feeding. It had not been described in scientific literature before that moment, despite its size and distinct form. Its existence had not been hidden by rarity alone, but by the absence of focused observation in the environments it inhabited. Accounts of a large cephalopod with extended arms had circulated for centuries among maritime communities, often framed within stories that blurred observation and imagination. The giant squid occupied a space between description and dismissal, its existence debated but unconfirmed. It was not until the early years of the 21st century that a living individual was photographed in its natural environment, followed by filmed footage several years later. The animal had been present throughout recorded history, yet remained unobserved in a way that met scientific standards. In more recent years, species of significant size have continued to emerge from within known waters. The Omura's whale, a baleen whale exceeding 40 feet in length, was formally recognized as a distinct species only in the early 2000s, despite its scale and presence in regions frequented by human activity. Similarly, the shepherd's beaked whale had been known primarily from stranded individuals, its behavior in the open ocean remaining undocumented until footage was captured in the early 21st century. Across these cases, a consistent structure appears. The animals were not newly evolved or recently introduced into their environments. They existed continuously, often known in some form to those who encountered them directly, while remaining outside the framework of formal scientific recognition. The delay between presence and acknowledgement did not arise from the absence of evidence in a broad sense, but from the absence of targeted investigation within the specific contexts where these animals lived. This pattern extends beyond individual discoveries into a broader understanding of how knowledge develops in marine environments. Observation alone is not always sufficient to produce recognition. It requires a convergence of attention, method, and location, a moment where the right tools are applied in the right place at the right time. Until that alignment occurs, even large and distinctive species can remain effectively unseen. Within this context, the accounts that describe a consistent animal in a defined region take on a different weight. They do not stand apart as isolated anomalies, but align with a history in which repeated observations preceded formal identification. A community with detailed knowledge of its environment, describing an animal with stable characteristics across generations, reflects a pattern that has been observed before. The difference lies not in the structure of the accounts, but in whether the conditions required for confirmation have yet been met. Size, in the deep ocean, does not follow the same limits that shape life closer to the surface, and the boundary between what seems possible and what is routinely observed begins to shift when organisms are placed within colder, darker, and more stable environments. This shift is not theoretical. It is documented across multiple groups of animals that have evolved under similar conditions, revealing a pattern often referred to as deep-sea gigantism, where species develop to dimensions far beyond those of their relatives in shallower water. Among the most direct examples is the giant isopod, a distant relative of small terrestrial pillbugs. While its shallow counterparts remain small enough to rest easily within a hand, the deep-sea form grows to lengths approaching 20 inches, its body expanded into proportions that reflect a different set of environmental pressures. The structure remains recognizable, yet the scale alters how it moves, feeds, and persists within its habitat. Cephalopods present a parallel case. The giant squid and the colossal squid extend far beyond the size of their shallow water relatives, reaching lengths that would seem improbable if considered in isolation. These animals exist within a context that supports such growth. Where temperature remains low, competition is distributed across vast volumes of water, and predation pressures differ from those found in more densely populated regions. The mechanisms underlying this pattern are tied closely to the conditions of the deep environment. Cold temperatures, slow metabolic processes, allowing organisms to grow over extended periods without the rapid turnover associated with warmer ecosystems. Growth becomes gradual and sustained, extending across time frames that exceed those typical of surface species. High pressure may influence cellular function and structural integrity, favoring forms that maintain stability under constant compression. At the same time, reduced competition for resources allows individuals to occupy ecological niches without the constraints imposed by crowded habitats. When these factors are applied to sharks, the pattern becomes more grounded. The Greenland shark provides a direct example of how extended lifespan and slow growth can produce large individuals within deep water environments. Its development occurs over centuries, resulting in a body size that exceeds that of many tropical species with similar anatomical frameworks. The process is not rapid, and it does not rely on accelerated growth. It is the accumulation of time under conditions that permit it. Extending this pattern to lamnid sharks introduces a pathway that does not require speculative biology. If a lineage adapted to deep conditions were subjected to the same pressures over many generations, gradual increases in size could occur without violating known principles of growth and evolution. The proportions described in the witness accounts, while exceeding those of the largest confirmed great whites, remain within a range that aligns with the structural possibilities of the family. The evolutionary record reinforces this perspective. Lamnid sharks have produced large forms before, with sizes reaching well beyond those observed in modern species. While the most extreme example belongs to an earlier period, intermediate sizes persisted long after, indicating that the capacity for substantial growth exists within the lineage. The disappearance of these larger forms does not eliminate the underlying biological potential. It reflects changes in environment, prey availability, and ecological balance over time. Within the Gulf, the conditions associated with deep-sea gigantism are present. Cold water persists at depth, pressure remains constant, and the vertical movement of prey introduces a dynamic that supports periodic feeding without requiring continuous activity. These factors create an environment where slow growth over extended periods becomes viable, allowing for the development of individuals that exceed the size of their shallow water counterparts. In this context, the question of scale becomes less about exceeding limits and more about operating within a different set of constraints. The deep does not produce size as an anomaly. It produces it as a consequence of conditions that favor longevity, efficiency, and gradual accumulation, allowing forms to emerge that would not be sustained elsewhere. Energy governs behavior in ways that are often invisible at the surface, shaping how an animal moves through its environment, how often it feeds, and how rarely it needs to be seen. For a predator reaching lengths between 30 and 40 feet, the demands would be substantial, measured not in constant consumption, but in cycles that alternate between intake and extended periods of low activity. Large marine predators are adapted to this rhythm, taking in significant amounts of energy during infrequent feeding events, then conserving that energy across intervals where movement remains minimal and deliberate. Within the Gulf, the available prey base supports such a strategy. Large marine mammals move through these waters in predictable patterns, including species such as the sperm whale, the fin whale, and the blue whale. Along the coasts, colonies of sea lions gather in significant numbers, while offshore waters sustain populations of large tuna and other pelagic fish. This distribution of prey does not require constant hunting. It allows for opportunistic feeding, where a single successful event can provide sufficient energy to sustain long periods of reduced activity. Sharks within the lamnid family already exhibit behaviors that extend into deeper regions of the ocean. Tagging studies have shown that individuals of species such as the great white can descend well below 3,000 feet, moving through layers of water that differ sharply from surface conditions. These vertical movements indicate that depth is not a barrier, but part of their range, suggesting that a lineage adapted further toward deep environments could incorporate these behaviors into a more consistent pattern. In such a model, hunting would not depend on continuous pursuit. It would center on positioning within zones where prey becomes accessible under specific conditions. The nightly ascent of midwater organisms creates a temporary concentration of life near the boundary between depth and surface, drawing larger animals upward in response. A predator adapted to this cycle could remain below for most of its time, rising only when this movement brings prey within reach. The ascent would be timed rather than constant, aligned with a predictable environmental rhythm. Observations of large sharks interacting with unfamiliar objects provide additional context for reported encounters. When approaching vessels, these animals often exhibit slow, circling movements, maintaining a steady distance before making contact or departing. This behavior is understood as investigatory, a method of assessing objects within their environment without immediate aggression. The motion is controlled, the approach measured, reflecting a pattern that prioritizes information gathering over rapid action. When scaled to a larger body, the same behavior would produce different effects. A predator of substantial mass making contact with a vessel would generate force disproportionate to its intent. What is a minor interaction from the perspective of the animal could register as a significant impact from the perspective of those on the boat. The reports of vessels being struck from below or alongside align with this interpretation, where contact arises from proximity and investigation rather than directed attack. The infrequency of such encounters fits within this framework. An animal that spends the majority of its time at depth, rising only under specific conditions, would intersect with human activity rarely. Its appearances would cluster around times and locations where environmental factors align rather than occurring randomly across the Gulf. Each encounter would be brief, limited to the period during which the animal remains near the surface before returning below. This pattern does not require continuous visibility or frequent interaction. It depends on a balance between energy intake, environmental cycles, and movement through vertical space. The predator remains present within the system, yet only enters the observable layer under conditions that do not occur constantly. Its behavior follows the structure of the Gulf itself, shaped by the same processes that govern the movement of smaller organisms, scaled upward into a form that remains largely unseen except at the points where those processes briefly intersect with the surface. Skill on the water develops into a kind of quiet calibration where repeated exposure refines perception until small deviations stand out with clarity. For commercial fishermen working the Gulf, this calibration is not occasional but continuous, built across years in which the majority of days are spent observing currents, animal movement, and subtle changes in behavior that determine where to go and when to return. Their understanding of what is normal does not come from isolated encounters. It emerges from a baseline formed through repetition, a familiarity that most observers never have the opportunity to develop. Within this context, an observation that falls outside that baseline carries a different weight. It is not simply a reaction to an unfamiliar moment. It is a recognition of something that does not fit within a well-established pattern. When an experienced mariner reports such a deviation, the report is anchored in contrast with everything they have previously seen. The difference may be brief, but it is measured against a lifetime of reference, giving it a specificity that extends beyond casual impression. This perspective becomes more grounded when considering the conditions under which these reports are made. There is no clear incentive to fabricate encounters of this kind. For fishermen who depend on reputation and trust, describing an anomalous event can introduce doubt among clients and peers. Stories that cannot be easily verified carry the risk of being dismissed, and that dismissal can translate into lost opportunities or diminished standing within a tightly connected community. The cost of such a report is tangible, while the benefit remains uncertain. In some cases, the response to an encounter has extended beyond description into behavior. Certain individuals have adjusted their routes, avoiding specific areas after experiencing something they could not account for. These changes are not symbolic. They affect catch patterns, fuel use, and the practical rhythms of work, introducing an economic consequence that reinforces the sincerity of the original observation. Altering established routes is not undertaken lightly, especially in an environment where efficiency determines sustainability. Across generations, the consistency of these accounts becomes more apparent. Within some families, encounters have been reported over 3 successive generations, each describing the same features within the same regions of water. The continuity does not rely on embellishment. It is maintained through repetition of the same core elements, passed along not as a story to be expanded, but as a detail to be noted. The stability of these descriptions over time suggests that they are not shaped by imagination, but by repeated exposure to the same phenomenon. The structure of the accounts themselves reflects a notable restraint. They do not build toward dramatic conclusions or extend into narratives of pursuit or conflict. Instead, they remain focused on observation, describing an animal that appears, moves in proximity to the vessel, and then disappears. The absence of escalation is significant. It indicates that the emphasis remains on what was seen rather than on how it might be interpreted or retold. When these reports are compared across different groups, an additional layer of consistency emerges. Mexican commercial fishermen visiting sport fishing operators and earlier coastal communities describe an animal with the same essential characteristics, despite operating within different contexts and without clear pathways of communication regarding such accounts. The alignment occurs without evidence of shared narrative development, suggesting that the observations arise independently from similar encounters. Taken together, these elements reposition the witness pool within a different framework. The accounts are not isolated anecdotes detached from experience. They are observations made by individuals whose daily work depends on accurate reading of the marine environment, recorded in a manner that reflects both familiarity and caution. The repetition of specific details, the lack of incentive to exaggerate, and the willingness to adjust behavior in response all contribute to a body of testimony that functions less as story and more as a form of data, shaped by experience and sustained through consistency. Reluctance can take shape not as denial, but as a careful distance maintained between observation and conclusion, a space where uncertainty is managed rather than resolved. Within marine science, that distance is shaped by a long history of claims that did not hold under scrutiny, a pattern that has left certain categories of inquiry associated with more speculation than evidence. The field often described as cryptozoology carries much of this weight, having produced far more assertions than confirmations. For researchers whose work depends on credibility and peer review, engagement with such topics introduces a measurable risk, not because every claim is without merit, but because the category itself has become difficult to separate from its least reliable examples. In this context, the accounts under consideration occupy an unusual position. They are too consistent to be dismissed without examination, yet they lack the physical evidence required to move comfortably within established scientific frameworks. The result is a kind of suspension where the data exists but does not fully enter the system that would evaluate it. It remains outside formal study, not because it has been disproven, but because it has not been structured in a way that aligns with institutional expectations. Practical considerations reinforce this distance. Funding for marine research is directed toward issues with immediate and measurable impact, including climate processes, fisheries management, and environmental change. These areas carry clear implications for ecosystems and human activity, making them priorities within limited budgets. An unconfirmed animal, without physical samples or direct observation, does not compete easily within this structure. The absence of tangible evidence places it at a disadvantage, regardless of the consistency of the reports that suggest its presence. Alongside these institutional factors, perceptual psychology introduces another layer that cannot be overlooked. Human estimation of size in open water, particularly under low light, is subject to distortion. Without stable reference points, objects can appear larger or closer than they are, and the presence of expectation can influence interpretation. When an observer is aware of a narrative associated with a particular region, ambiguous shapes may be understood within that framework, reinforcing a pre-existing idea. Fear or heightened attention can further amplify these effects, altering perception in ways that feel immediate and convincing. These mechanisms account for a portion of the observations, and acknowledging them is part of maintaining intellectual consistency. Not every report carries equal weight, and some may reflect the interplay between environment and perception rather than the presence of a distinct animal. The variability in human observation is well documented, and it remains an essential factor in evaluating any account that relies on visual interpretation alone. Yet, there is a boundary to what these explanations can encompass. Psychological factors can distort individual perception, but they do not easily produce identical descriptions across independent observers separated by culture, language, and time. The repetition of specific details, maintained across generations and geographic locations, suggests a structure that extends beyond isolated misinterpretation. Variations in perception would be expected to produce variations in description, yet the core elements remain aligned with a consistency that does not follow the typical patterns of narrative drift. This distinction marks the point where hesitation becomes separate from resolution. The reluctance to engage with the subject reflects an understandable caution, shaped by historical precedent and practical constraints. It does not, however, function as an answer. The absence of formal investigation leaves the underlying question in place, neither confirmed nor dismissed, held within a space defined by limited data and competing interpretations. In this balance, the situation remains open. Institutional caution preserves standards of evidence, while the persistence of consistent accounts maintains the presence of an unresolved observation. The distance between these positions is not fixed, but it continues to exist, shaped by the same factors that have guided scientific inquiry in other cases, where recognition followed only after attention shifted toward what had been overlooked. Skepticism often gathers around a simple expectation that if something large exists, it should leave something behind, a trace that can be held, measured, or cataloged. In an environment shaped by depth and time, that expectation begins to shift, not because evidence is absent, but because the conditions that preserve it are different from those at the surface. The question of remains becomes less about whether they exist and more about how long they persist once they appear. Sharks present a particular challenge in this regard. Their bodies are built primarily from cartilage rather than bone, a material that supports movement and flexibility but does not endure after death in the way mineralized skeletons do. In shallower environments, even cartilage can sometimes leave an imprint under specific conditions, but in deeper water, decomposition proceeds without interruption. A large shark descending into the depths does not leave a lasting structure behind. Its form dissolves, its framework breaking down until nothing remains that would register as a skeleton. The process accelerates through the presence of scavenger communities adapted to these conditions. Organisms such as hagfish, amphipods, and members of the sleeper shark group converge rapidly on available organic material, reducing it through continuous feeding. What might seem substantial at the surface becomes transient below, transformed through a network of consumption that leaves little intact. Under optimal conditions, even a large carcass can be stripped down within a matter of days, its mass redistributed across smaller forms that carry it into the surrounding ecosystem. Teeth, however, follow a different trajectory. Composed of dense materials that resist decay, they persist after the rest of the body has disappeared. Sharks shed teeth throughout their lives, replacing them continuously as part of their biology. In principle, these teeth could provide a record of presence, accumulating over time across the sea floor. Yet the scale of the environment complicates this possibility. A deep-dwelling animal moving through vast areas would disperse these teeth across distances that extend far beyond any single point of observation. Each tooth becomes one small object within an expansive and largely unmapped terrain. Locating such remains without deliberate effort becomes a matter of chance rather than expectation. The areas where a large, deep-dwelling shark would spend most of its time have not been systematically sampled. Deep-sea trawling operations, constrained by equipment and risk, rarely reach the lower portions of the basin, and when they do, they cover limited ground relative to the total area. The absence of targeted sampling means that even durable remains can remain undiscovered, not because they do not exist, but because they have not been encountered. There are instances where large marine remains persist long enough to be observed, providing a point of comparison. When a whale dies and sinks, its body can form what is known as a whale fall, a localized ecosystem that supports a sequence of organisms over extended periods. In the Gulf, such events have been documented, with communities developing around these remains and persisting for years. These cases demonstrate that large carcasses can endure under certain conditions, but they also depend on the carcass being located before it is fully consumed or dispersed. The distinction lies in the probability of discovery. A whale fall that is observed becomes part of the record, while many others remain unseen, existing and dissipating without documentation. The same principle applies to other large animals, where the presence of remains depends not only on their survival after death, but on whether they intersect with the limited areas that have been explored. Within this framework, the absence of recovered remains does not function as a definitive measure of absence. It reflects the scale of the environment and the limitations of sampling within it. The deeper regions of the Gulf remain only partially examined, leaving large volumes of space where evidence could exist without having been encountered. The question persists within that space, shaped less by what has been found than by how little of the relevant environment has been directly observed. Resolution, in this case, does not depend on speculation or distant theory, but on a set of tools already in use, methods that have been refined to detect life in places where direct observation remains difficult. The gap between what is reported and what is confirmed exists not because the question cannot be addressed, but because the specific combination of effort and focus has not yet been applied within the precise zones where the pattern of encounters suggests it should be. One of the most direct approaches begins with water itself. Every organism leaves behind traces of its presence, fragments of genetic material released through skin, waste, and microscopic processes that occur continuously as it moves through its environment. Environmental DNA sampling captures these traces, filtering water and analyzing it for sequences that correspond to known or unknown species. This method has already confirmed the presence of large sharks in enclosed bodies of water where direct sightings had been limited or absent. Applied to the deeper regions of the Gulf, it could reveal whether a large predatory species exists within those layers, even if it is rarely seen. Beyond chemical traces, physical observation can extend into depths that were once inaccessible. Autonomous underwater vehicles, designed to withstand the pressures of the deep basin, are capable of operating for extended periods while collecting visual and acoustic data. These machines can move slowly through the water column, mapping terrain, recording movement, and capturing images in high resolution. Deployed within the corridor where sightings are most concentrated, they would provide continuous coverage of an area that has so far been observed only intermittently. Sound offers another pathway into this environment. Large animals moving through water generate pressure changes that propagate as low-frequency signals, detectable by sensitive instruments placed at depth. Hydrophone arrays, already used to monitor seismic activity and the movements of whales, could be adapted or expanded to listen for patterns consistent with a large shark moving through the basin. The presence of such signals, repeated over time, would establish a form of evidence independent of direct visual confirmation. A more focused method involves stationary observation at depth. Baited camera systems can be lowered below 6,000 feet, left in place for extended periods, and later retrieved with recorded footage. These deployments rely on the attraction of scent to draw animals into view, creating an opportunity to capture images of species that might otherwise remain out of reach. Compared to other approaches, this method is relatively low in cost, yet capable of producing clear visual data when placed in the correct locations. Taken together, these techniques form a framework that does not rely on chance encounters. They operate systematically, sampling water, recording sound, and observing movement over time. Each method addresses a different aspect of the environment, and when combined, they create overlapping layers of detection that increase the likelihood of identifying what moves within the deeper regions of the Gulf. The resources required to implement such an investigation remain modest when considered within the broader scale of marine research. A coordinated effort spanning approximately 18 months, incorporating these methods across the identified zones, would fall within a budget range of a few $1,000,000, comparable to the cost of producing a single large-scale documentary. The limitation is not technological, nor is it financial beyond reach. It is a matter of priority and allocation. Within the time it takes for proposals to be reviewed and funding decisions to be made, the environment continues to operate as it always has. The vertical movements of prey persist, the deeper layers remain active, and any large predator adapted to these conditions would continue its pattern of ascent and descent. Each night, the same convergence of factors occurs, creating moments where the boundary between depth and surface becomes briefly accessible, then closes again. The question remains situated within that cycle, not fixed in place, but moving through time with the same regularity as the processes that shape it. The distinction between unknown and unknowable rests on whether attention is directed toward it, and until that shift occurs, the Gulf continues to hold its deeper layers in a state that is not hidden by mystery, but by the absence of sustained observation. Long before any chart outlines boundaries or regulations attempt to define limits, human behavior has already begun to shape the waters in quieter ways. Guided by patterns that do not appear in official records, yet persist with remarkable consistency. In the Gulf, where pressure on marine life has intensified across decades, these patterns reveal themselves not through policy, but through absence, through places that are avoided rather than exploited, left undisturbed for reasons that are rarely written down. The broader context is not subtle. Since the latter half of the 20th century, industrial and small-scale fishing have reduced many populations within the region, particularly toward the shallower northern reaches where access is easiest and enforcement is weakest. Nets have reached farther, vessels have multiplied, and the cumulative effect has been a steady decline in species that once defined the productivity of these waters. Against this backdrop, any region that remains comparatively intact stands out, not as an anomaly of abundance, but as a consequence of reduced pressure. Along the corridor, where deeper waters rise beneath the routes of passing boats, a different pattern emerges. Fishermen who work these areas regularly carry with them an inherited understanding of where to go and where not to linger. When an encounter occurs, described not in dramatic terms, but in the same restrained language that has marked accounts across generations, the response is immediate and practical. Lines are pulled, engines are turned, and the vessel moves away without hesitation. The reasoning is seldom framed as belief. It is presented as experience, a quiet recognition that certain conditions are not worth testing. Over time, this response has accumulated into something more structured, though it remains informal. Within cooperatives and among independent crews, the expectation is clear. Areas associated with these encounters are not revisited lightly, especially after dusk when visibility narrows and the surface gives fewer cues. Captains who take passengers into open water adjust their routes accordingly, often declining to enter specific zones during certain hours, not as a concession to myth, but as a matter of responsibility. The language used is careful, grounded in safety and liability, yet the outcome is the same. Portions of the Gulf are left alone during the periods when they would otherwise be most accessible. Marine researchers working in parallel have noted an alignment that is difficult to ignore. The regions avoided through these practices often coincide with zones of high biological productivity, areas where nutrient flow supports dense concentrations of life, and where the balance between predator and prey remains more intact than in heavily fished waters. In other contexts, such regions would be candidates for formal protection, identified through surveys and designated through regulatory frameworks. Here, the effect is achieved without official designation, maintained instead through a distributed network of decisions made by individuals who share information across time. This alignment is not unique to this place. Across different parts of the world, similar patterns have been observed where cultural narratives, whether framed as sacred spaces or zones of caution, result in reduced human impact. The mechanism varies, but the outcome is consistent. Areas associated with restraint tend to preserve higher levels of biodiversity, not because the underlying belief is tested or confirmed, but because the behavior it encourages limits extraction. In the Gulf, the figure at the center of these patterns remains undefined, yet its influence is measurable. By shaping movement, by introducing hesitation into decisions that might otherwise favor expansion, it creates pockets of relative stability within a broader system under strain. The effect does not depend on verification. It operates through repetition, through the steady transmission of caution from one generation to the next, embedding itself into the routines of those who depend on the water. Within that quiet structure, the deeper regions continue to function with a degree of continuity that is increasingly rare. Activity rises and falls, migrations pass through, and the layered system of life remains less interrupted than it might otherwise be. Whatever moves through these waters, whether fully understood or not, its presence has already altered the way humans interact with the environment around it, creating boundaries that exist not on maps, but in memory and practice, sustained through choices that leave parts of the Gulf undisturbed. Measured against what the open ocean already holds, the boundary between the expected and the extraordinary begins to soften, not through speculation, but through accumulation of confirmed realities that quietly exceed familiar scale. The deeper layers of the sea are not defined by absence, but by forms of life that operate beyond ordinary reference points. Creatures whose dimensions and behaviors were once dismissed simply because they had not yet been observed directly. Consider the sperm whale, a presence both massive and methodical, reaching lengths that stretch far beyond the vessels that occasionally cross its path. Its dives extend thousands of feet below the surface, into regions where pressure builds and light disappears entirely. When it returns, its skin sometimes carries the record of encounters below, circular scars and elongated marks left by squid that inhabit those depths. These marks are not incidental. They are evidence of interactions between animals that rarely enter human awareness, each adapted to conditions that would otherwise seem inhospitable, each existing as part of a system that unfolds far beneath the visible ocean. In those same depths, the colossal squid moves with a different design, its body structured for a world without sunlight. Its eyes, among the largest known in any animal, are tuned to detect faint disturbances, subtle glows produced by smaller organisms reacting to movement in the dark. The scale of those eyes alone suggests an environment where perception depends on sensitivity rather than brightness, where even the slightest shift in light can signal the approach of something larger. This is not an abstraction. Specimens have been recovered, measured, and studied, confirming a form that once belonged more to legend than to recorded biology. Closer to the surface, though still rarely encountered, the oarfish drifts through the water column, its length extending well beyond that of most known fishes. Its appearance is so unfamiliar that early sightings were often interpreted through the language available at the time, described as serpents or elongated apparitions moving just beneath the surface. Only with repeated observations did its identity settle into scientific classification, revealing that what seemed implausible was simply uncommon. Even organisms without rigid structure can reach scales that challenge expectation. The lion's mane jellyfish extends its tentacles across distances that rival the length of the largest whales, forming drifting networks that occupy significant volumes of water. These structures move with currents, largely unseen, yet fully present, their dimensions confirmed through careful measurement rather than anecdote. Within the family of sleeper sharks, a pattern appears that complicates assumptions about where large animals can exist. Species adapted to colder regions have been recorded in deeper, warmer bodies of water, occupying layers where temperature and pressure recreate conditions similar to those of their typical range. Their presence demonstrates a flexibility that allows large predators to inhabit environments that, at the surface, would seem unsuitable, extending the known distribution of animals that already operate at considerable scale. Then there are forms that remain incomplete, known only through early stages. Large eel larvae have been collected from deep trawls, transparent bodies drifting in currents, their size indicating a developmental pathway toward adults, far larger than any confirmed specimen. The relationship between larval size and adult length in eels is well established, and when those ratios are applied, the implied dimensions extend beyond what has been directly observed. The larvae exist as tangible evidence. The adults remain unrecorded, not disproven, simply absent from current documentation. Across all of these examples, a consistent pattern emerges. The ocean does not resist, producing large, unusual, or rarely seen organisms. It does so repeatedly, across different lineages and environmental niches, often revealing them only after long periods of uncertainty. What appears extraordinary at one moment becomes documented reality at another, not because the ocean changes, but because observation catches up to what was already there. Within that context, the possibility of another large, elusive inhabitant does not stand outside the established character of the sea. It aligns with it, fitting into a continuum where scale, rarity, and limited observation intersect. The baseline shifts quietly, not through assertion, but through recognition that the ocean's capacity for sustaining immense and seldom seen life is already demonstrated, again and again, in forms that were once considered unlikely and are now simply part of the known world. Beneath the visible surface, long before any vessel cuts across open water, an immense movement begins to gather, rising not in waves but in life itself. A vertical shifting of entire communities that repeat with such regularity they form one of the largest daily migrations on the planet. This movement is not guided by tides or storms, but by light, or more precisely, by the fading of it. As the boundary between day and night triggers a response embedded across countless species that occupy the depths, far below the reach of sunlight during the day, at depths ranging from several hundred to several thousand feet, vast populations remain suspended in a dim, compressed world. Lanternfish drift in dense schools, squid hover with slow adjustments of their fins, and small crustaceans pulse through the water in steady, coordinated motion. As daylight diminishes above, these organisms begin to rise, not in isolation, but together, forming a migrating layer that ascends through the water column toward the surface where food becomes temporarily accessible. This ascent is not subtle in scale. It was first detected not through direct observation, but through instruments designed for entirely different purposes. During the mid-20th century, sonar operators noticed what appeared to be a false seafloor, a reflective layer that moved upward at night and sank again before morning. Only later was it understood that this signal came from living organisms, their collective presence dense enough to return acoustic echoes as though they were solid ground. What had seemed like a technical anomaly revealed itself as a biological phenomenon of extraordinary magnitude. The mass involved in this nightly migration exceeds intuitive expectation. The combined biomass of these ascending communities is so large that, in some estimates, it rivals or surpasses that of all visible surface life. Each individual organism is small, often only a few inches in length, yet their numbers transform them into a shifting structure that occupies vast volumes of water. They rise to feed on plankton and other resources near the surface, then retreat again before dawn, avoiding predators that depend on light to hunt. In the Gulf, where productivity at the surface is amplified by nutrient-rich currents rising from depth, this migration becomes especially concentrated. The abundance above feeds the density below, creating a system where the vertical movement of life is both more intense and more predictable. As evening approaches, the boundary between deeper darkness and surface dimness becomes a zone of convergence, a place where organisms from below meet the outer limits of the illuminated world. Within this shifting boundary, conditions align for larger predators that operate outside the usual constraints of surface visibility. An animal adapted to depth, capable of navigating cold, dark water for extended periods, would encounter a concentrated field of prey during these ascents. Rather than roaming widely, it could follow this vertical movement, rising only as far as necessary to intercept the migration, feeding within the narrow band where prey density peaks, then descending again as the layer retreats. Such behavior would not require constant presence near the surface. It would produce appearances that are brief and infrequent, aligned with specific times of night and limited to areas where the migration is most pronounced. The pattern would not spread evenly across the region, but concentrate above deeper basins where the vertical distance allows for the greatest accumulation of organisms during ascent. The timing of these movements is consistent, governed by cycles that repeat with minimal variation. The ascent begins at dusk, reaches its highest point during the early hours of darkness, and reverses as the first light approaches. Any interaction between surface observers and a deep-dwelling predator following this migration would therefore occur within that narrow window, when the boundary between worlds briefly overlaps. This migration is not hypothetical. It is measured, recorded, and observed across multiple oceans, a fundamental process that shapes the distribution of life from depth to surface. Its presence provides a framework through which patterns at the surface can be understood, linking brief encounters to a larger system that operates beyond immediate perception, a system that brings the deep upward each night, then carries it back into darkness before the day returns. Time in this place does not announce itself through abrupt change, but through repetition, through the steady accumulation of observations that settle into continuity across generations. Along this stretch of water, where human presence has remained closely tied to survival, knowledge has been carried not as abstraction, but as necessity, refined through direct experience and preserved through careful transmission. Within that continuity, a particular description appears again and again, anchored not to a single moment, but to a span of centuries that unfolds without altering its core. Long before external records began to trace activity along these coasts, the people who lived here had already formed a detailed understanding of the water and everything within it. Their awareness extended beyond surface conditions into patterns of movement, behavior, and presence that defined where to travel and where to avoid. Among these observations, one stands apart, not as a symbol or metaphor, but as a distinct entity associated with specific regions and conditions. The naming reflects recognition rather than invention, a way of marking something encountered repeatedly enough to require identification. When written accounts eventually appear, they do not replace this earlier knowledge but echo it. Mission records from the late 17th and early 18th centuries note warnings given by those who knew the water intimately, describing an animal that aligns closely with the earlier oral descriptions. These entries are not framed as folklore, but as practical information recorded alongside other observations relevant to travel and survival. The continuity between these sources suggests a shared reference point rather than a borrowed idea. As maritime activity expanded, additional records began to accumulate. Logs from the 19th century include reports that describe encounters in operational terms, focusing on physical impact and location rather than narrative embellishment. The same elements persist: a large, dark form, a presence that moves with measured intent, appearing briefly near the surface before disappearing again. These details carry forward into the 20th century, where fishing crews operating in the same corridors describe encounters that align closely with earlier accounts, differing in circumstance but not in substance. Moving into more recent decades, individual reports continue to follow this established pattern. Observations made by experienced captains, supported by deliberate attempts to estimate size and behavior, add further consistency to the record. These accounts are collected, compared, and examined, revealing a data set that spans centuries without significant deviation in its defining characteristics. The animal described remains consistent in scale, in coloration, in the proportion of its dorsal fin, and in the way it approaches and leaves the surface environment. What becomes notable over this extended timeline is not the frequency of sightings, but their stability. Folklore typically evolves, absorbing new influences, adapting to different contexts, and accumulating variations that reflect the cultures through which it passes. In this case, the description resists that process. It does not expand into elaborate narratives or shift in response to external ideas. Instead, it maintains a narrow, precise set of attributes that persist regardless of who is reporting the encounter or when it occurs. Across 3 centuries, the same regions continue to produce the same observations, recorded by individuals separated by time, but connected through the shared environment they navigate. The Gulf itself remains the constant, its deeper structures unchanged on human timescales, providing a stable backdrop against which these repeated encounters unfold. Generations observe, record, and pass on what they have seen, each adding to a continuity that extends beyond individual lifetimes. Within that span, biological realities intersect with temporal scale in ways that narrow the distance between past and present. Certain species known to inhabit cold, deep waters are capable of lifespans that extend across centuries, growing slowly and persisting far longer than most vertebrates. When such durations are considered alongside the continuity of the sightings, the possibility emerges that encounters separated by decades or even centuries could involve the same individual organism. This is not a departure from established science, but a reflection of it, applied within a specific context where conditions support extended longevity. The result is a narrative that does not rely on sudden revelation, but on sustained observation, a record that builds quietly over time, grounded in repeated experience rather than isolated events. In the same water, across generations, the same form is described, moving through a landscape that changes little at depth, its presence marked by consistency rather than variation, carried forward through time as part of an ongoing, unbroken account. In the formal record of marine science, where observations are sorted, tested, and refined into published knowledge, there is a notable absence that does not arise from contradiction, but from omission. Across decades of research in the Gulf, encompassing fisheries, migration patterns, and environmental change, one particular set of reports has never crossed the threshold into formal investigation. It exists instead at the edges of awareness, acknowledged in conversation, occasionally referenced, yet never translated into the kind of structured inquiry that would bring it fully into view. This absence becomes more defined when placed against the volume of material that has been studied and published. Entire ecosystems within the region have been mapped in detail, their dynamics tracked through long-term observation and increasingly precise instrumentation. Species are cataloged, behaviors documented, and environmental pressures analyzed with a level of rigor that reflects both technological capability and institutional focus. Within this extensive body of work, the lack of a dedicated study addressing a consistent, multi-generational set of sightings stands out not as a rejection, but as a gap. The closest approach to formal documentation has come from outside traditional academic pathways. Structured collections of witness accounts have been assembled with care, using consistent methodologies to reduce variation and isolate common elements. These efforts, while detailed, exist within a different category of publication, one that does not intersect easily with mainstream scientific discourse. As a result, the data they contain remains largely unexamined by the broader community that would typically evaluate such material through peer review and replication. Informal engagement has occurred in quieter ways. Marine biologists presented with aggregated descriptions have noted their alignment with known anatomical forms, recognizing patterns that correspond to established categories of large predatory fish. These observations, however, remain conversational, lacking the formal context required to initiate deeper investigation. Without institutional backing, such insights do not translate into field studies, sampling campaigns, or deployment of specialized equipment that could test the presence of an unknown organism within the region. The structure of research funding contributes significantly to this dynamic. Resources are allocated based on criteria that prioritize immediate ecological impact, economic relevance, and the capacity to address pressing environmental concerns. Issues such as declining fish stocks, habitat degradation, and changing ocean chemistry command attention because their consequences are measurable and urgent. Within this framework, a phenomenon without physical evidence, despite its consistency, does not align with established priorities, making it difficult to justify the allocation of limited resources. Alongside funding considerations, there exists a layer of professional caution shaped by the norms of academic practice. Fields associated with unverified or speculative claims carry a degree of reputational risk, influencing the decisions of researchers who must navigate both scientific curiosity and career stability. Engaging with a subject perceived as uncertain can divert attention from work that is more readily validated, affecting publication opportunities and professional standing. This dynamic does not reflect a lack of interest, but a calibration of effort within a system that rewards certain types of inquiry over others. These factors, taken together, create conditions where a question can persist without being addressed directly. The absence of published research does not indicate that the phenomenon has been examined and dismissed. It indicates that it has not been examined within the formal structures that would allow for confirmation or refutation. The distinction is subtle but significant, separating a conclusion from a lack of investigation. Within this quiet space, the reports continue to accumulate, existing parallel to the established body of knowledge, neither integrated nor resolved. The water remains the same, the observations maintain their consistency, and the tools required to investigate are available, yet unused in this specific context. The silence that surrounds the subject is not a final statement, but a reflection of how scientific attention is directed, revealing as much about the system that governs inquiry as it does about the phenomenon that remains, for now, beyond its focus. Before any names settled onto its surface, before coastlines were traced into maps or currents described in measured terms, this body of water was already in motion, forming slowly as the land itself shifted and separated. The basin deepened over immense spans of time, shaped by forces that continue beneath it, quiet and persistent. The water that fills it today carries that history, layered not only in depth but in duration, extending far beyond the brief window of human observation. The Gulf emerged as the peninsula moved away from the mainland, a gradual widening that allowed the sea to enter and settle, creating a system that is still evolving. Beneath the surface, the same tectonic processes remain active, maintaining a connection between geological movement and the environment above. This continuity links the present to a past measured not in generations, but in epochs, where the structure of the basin has been defined and redefined over spans of time that exceed ordinary comprehension. Within that long formation, life has adapted and persisted, occupying the spaces created by depth, temperature, and pressure. The deeper regions, shielded from surface change, offer conditions that remain stable across vast periods, allowing organisms to exist within environments that shift far more slowly than those above. In such places, continuity becomes the defining feature, with ecosystems that evolve at a pace aligned with the gradual changes of the basin itself. Human presence, by comparison, enters this timeline briefly, yet with a depth of engagement that reflects necessity. The communities that have lived along these shores for thousands of years developed an understanding rooted in direct interaction, where knowledge is accumulated through repeated experience rather than formal documentation. Their awareness extends into patterns that are not immediately visible, recognizing consistencies that emerge only through long familiarity with the water. Generations of fishing families have added to this understanding, navigating the same routes, observing the same conditions, and refining their sense of what belongs and what does not. Their knowledge is not abstract, but practical, shaped by daily reliance on the sea for livelihood. Within this context, deviations from the expected are not easily dismissed, as they are measured against a baseline established over years of continuous observation. Across these overlapping timelines, from geological formation to human experience, a single feature remains consistent. The deeper portions of the Gulf have not been fully explored, not in the sense that would reveal everything they contain. Modern instruments extend perception into these regions, mapping contours and recording signals, yet large volumes of water remain beyond detailed examination. The scale of the environment ensures that even with advanced technology, complete coverage remains out of reach. This continuity of the unknown does not suggest absence, but capacity. The depth itself provides space, a physical allowance for processes and organisms that do not intersect regularly with the surface world. Conditions at these levels create separation, limiting the exchange between what is seen and what remains below. Within that separation, time operates differently, preserving structures and patterns that may persist without interruption. The water, in this sense, functions as a repository, holding within it layers of activity that extend beyond immediate perception. It retains not only the history of its formation, but the ongoing presence of systems that unfold at depths rarely reached. What has been observed represents only a portion of that reality, a surface expression of a much larger, more complex environment. To recognize this is not to suggest mystery as an endpoint, but to acknowledge proportion. The Gulf, like much of the ocean, contains more than has been fully cataloged, not because it resists understanding, but because its scale exceeds the current limits of observation. The absence of complete knowledge becomes a reflection of that scale, a reminder that even within a defined space, there remain dimensions that continue to operate beyond immediate reach. Held quietly within the water itself, perspective widens slowly when the frame expands beyond the shoreline, revealing not only distance, but proportion, a sense of how much remains outside direct experience, despite the appearance of familiarity. The surface of the ocean reflects light and motion, yet beneath that thin boundary lies a volume so vast that even modern exploration touches only a fraction of it. What has been mapped, sampled, and observed represents a narrow layer within a much larger system that extends downward into regions rarely visited and only partially understood. Human exploration has reached outward into space with clarity and repetition, placing instruments and individuals on distant bodies, tracing their surfaces with increasing precision. The comparison is not abstract. The number of people who have traveled beyond the atmosphere exceeds those who have descended to the deepest parts of the ocean. Remote sensing technologies have produced detailed images of other planets, while large portions of the ocean floor remain outlined only in broad strokes, their finer features unresolved. The first descent to the deepest known trench occurred in the mid-20th century, marking a moment of entry into an environment defined by pressure and darkness. Since then, such journeys have remained rare, constrained by the technical challenges of operating at extreme depth. Within the Gulf, no crewed mission has reached the deepest basin, leaving that space explored primarily through indirect methods, instruments that record without fully revealing the complexity of what exists there. When exploration does reach these environments, it often encounters systems that challenge prior assumptions. The discovery of hydrothermal vent communities revealed forms of life that operate independently of sunlight, drawing energy from chemical processes within the Earth itself. Organisms adapted to these conditions thrive in complete darkness, their existence demonstrating that biological systems can develop along pathways not previously considered. These ecosystems were present long before they were observed, functioning continuously without reference to the surface world. Each expansion of exploration into deeper regions has brought similar adjustments, introducing organisms that reshape understanding of size, adaptation, and ecological interaction. The patterns that emerge do not suggest rarity in the sense of exception, but rather indicate that the ocean supports a wide range of forms, many of which remain outside current observation simply because the environments they inhabit are difficult to access. The deeper ocean operates according to conditions that differ fundamentally from those at the surface. Pressure increases steadily, temperature stabilizes near freezing, and light disappears entirely, creating a setting where familiar reference points no longer apply. Within this framework, biological processes adjust, producing organisms that reflect the constraints and opportunities of their environment. Movement, growth, and interaction occur within parameters that are only partially understood, shaped by factors that are still being studied. To approach this environment is to recognize that it is not fully mapped, not fully sampled, and not fully interpreted. The unknown is not a temporary gap awaiting simple resolution, but a substantial portion of the system itself. Instruments extend awareness, yet they do not replace direct presence, and even where data is collected, interpretation follows gradually, requiring time and repeated observation. Within this broader context, any single question becomes part of a larger pattern. Observations that remain unexplained are not isolated from the rest of the ocean's complexity, but embedded within it. The absence of definitive answers reflects the scale of what is being studied, a system where much remains beyond immediate reach. The Gulf, with its depth and structure, exists within this global framework, sharing in the same limitations and possibilities that define deep ocean exploration. What lies beneath its surface is part of an environment that continues to reveal itself slowly, shaped by processes that extend beyond direct observation. In this setting, uncertainty is not a failure of inquiry, but an inherent feature of engaging with a space that remains, in large measure, uncharted, holding within it layers of reality that are still being uncovered. There is a quiet arithmetic that sits beneath the surface of what is known, a ratio that shifts as exploration extends further into depths that have rarely been touched. Marine biologists working with global datasets have converged on an estimate that remains striking in its scale, suggesting that the overwhelming majority of ocean species have yet to be formally described. The number is not a precise boundary, but it falls within a narrow range, placing the unknown far above the cataloged, a reminder that absence of record is not absence of life, only absence of encounter. This imbalance is not evenly distributed. The shallow margins of the ocean, close to shore and accessible to routine sampling, are comparatively well understood. It is the deeper water, extending downward, beyond the reach of ordinary equipment, that holds the greatest share of what has not yet been seen. Each improvement in submersible design, imaging clarity, and sampling technique opens a small window into that space, and through it, new forms continue to appear, often without precedent in existing classifications. The rate of discovery does not slow as knowledge accumulates. It accelerates, not because the ocean is changing, but because the tools used to observe it are finally approaching the environments where diversity has remained concealed. Organisms adapted to pressure, darkness, and scarcity occupy niches that have been present for millions of years, evolving without interruption, indifferent to whether they are recognized or not. Even within groups that are assumed to be well documented, the pattern holds. New shark species continue to be described, sometimes emerging not from recent expeditions, but from specimens collected long ago and stored without full analysis. A small, dark species with distinctive features was identified only after careful examination of preserved material, its existence overlooked for decades despite being physically present within scientific collections. Another, equally elusive, followed a similar path, its recognition delayed not by rarity alone, but by the limits of attention and classification. These cases illustrate a constraint that is often unspoken. Discovery is not governed solely by presence in the environment, but by the convergence of observation, interpretation, and recognition. An organism can exist, be encountered, and still remain unnamed if the context required to understand it has not yet been assembled. The boundary between known and unknown is therefore not fixed by geography alone, but by the process through which knowledge is formed. At greater depths, where sampling becomes intermittent and visibility is restricted, this boundary expands. Large volumes of water remain unobserved, their contents inferred only indirectly through acoustic signals, scattered captures, or traces carried upward by currents. The absence of consistent surveys means that patterns cannot easily be established, and without patterns, classification remains incomplete. Within such an environment, the question of scale becomes less rigid than it appears at the surface. Size, behavior, and distribution are constrained by ecological conditions, yet those conditions vary across gradients that are only partially mapped. A large organism occupying a deep, productive basin would exist within a system capable of supporting it, provided that energy flows and environmental stability align in the necessary way. The Gulf, with its layered structure and persistent upwelling, offers such conditions, though the details remain under-examined at depth. Marine researchers who spend extended time working with deep water systems often describe an expectation that future discoveries will not simply add to existing categories, but alter them. This expectation does not arise from speculation, but from repeated experience, a pattern in which each new dataset reveals forms that were not anticipated beforehand. The unknown is not a single gap waiting to be filled, but a wide field that narrows only gradually. Within that field, the possibility of large, undescribed animals is not dismissed as an impossibility, but held within a framework of probability shaped by incomplete information. The ocean continues to produce organisms that were not predicted in places that were not previously accessible. Whether any specific report corresponds to such an organism remains unresolved, yet the broader category into which it would fall is established, grounded in the ongoing expansion of what has been found. The water holds more than has been recorded, and the process of learning what it contains moves forward at a pace defined not by what is present, but by how deeply it can be reached. At the edge of the southern Gulf, where familiar routes begin to thin into quieter corridors, daily practice has already absorbed the uncertainty that has been traced through these waters. Boats leave before sunrise, return before the light fades on certain nights, and curve gently away from coordinates that have no markers except memory. The adjustment is subtle, woven into routine rather than declared. It passes from one generation to the next, not as a story, but as instruction shaped by experience, a map drawn from repetition rather than theory. Men who have spent most of their lives at sea speak about these choices without embellishment. A shift in direction here, a refusal to anchor there, a preference for working certain depths only under full daylight. These decisions carry a cost, measured in distance traveled, fuel consumed, and opportunities left behind, yet they persist. The calculus is quiet and consistent, grounded in an understanding that not everything present in the water has been fully described, and that caution, once learned, is rarely abandoned. This way of moving through uncertainty mirrors a deeper pattern that extends beyond the shoreline. In its most careful form, scientific practice does not rush to close questions that remain open. It accumulates observations, tests them where possible, and holds the remainder without forcing them into conclusions that the evidence cannot sustain. The discipline lies not only in what is discovered, but in what is left unresolved, preserved intact, rather than simplified into certainty. There is a tendency, especially when confronted with something that resists easy classification, to divide outcomes into belief or dismissal. One asserts presence without proof, the other denies it without investigation. Both reach for resolution too quickly, replacing uncertainty with a form of confidence that the available data does not justify. The result is not clarity, but a narrowing of possibility, a premature boundary drawn around a question that has not yet been fully examined. In contrast, the approach shaped by long familiarity with the Gulf does not require final answers in order to function. It accepts that incomplete knowledge can still guide behavior, that patterns observed over time can inform decisions even when their underlying causes remain partially hidden. The water becomes a partner in this process, offering signals that are read through repetition, through attention sustained across years rather than moments. To live with a question of this scale is to accept that understanding may unfold slowly, if at all. It is to recognize that some forms of knowledge emerge not through immediate confirmation, but through the accumulation of consistent detail held carefully until a broader structure begins to take shape. The absence of closure is not a failure, but a condition that invites continued observation, a space in which curiosity remains active rather than resolved. There is a quiet steadiness in that posture. It does not require belief, nor does it depend on disbelief. It rests instead on attentiveness, on the willingness to notice what repeats, what remains consistent across time, and what resists explanation without being dismissed. In this sense, the fisherman and the scientist are engaged in the same act, moving through uncertainty with care, allowing the question to remain intact while gathering what can be known around it. The Gulf, with its layered depths and shifting currents, offers no immediate answers, only a field in which answers might eventually appear. Its surface reflects the sky, but beneath it extends a space where observation thins and inference begins. Within that space, questions persist, shaped by time, carried forward by those who continue to encounter them. There is something steadying in recognizing that not every question demands resolution in order to matter. Some endure because they are anchored in real observations, repeated often enough to resist dismissal, yet incomplete enough to remain open. They become part of the landscape, as present as the currents themselves, influencing movement without declaring their source. To stand within that kind of uncertainty is not to be lost. It is to be aware that the world extends beyond what has been mapped, and that understanding, like the water, deepens gradually. Before language settles around it, before it is named or explained, the reaction arrives first as a shift in awareness, a tightening of attention towards something that cannot yet be seen clearly. It is not constructed in the moment, but carried forward from a much older inheritance, shaped by countless encounters between living beings and environments where survival depended on recognizing limits. In the presence of deep water, that response becomes more pronounced, not because the water is inherently hostile, but because it represents a space where human perception and control are reduced. Across cultures, separated by distance and time, a similar unease appears when the surface of the ocean gives way to depth. The feeling is not tied to a single story or a specific creature. It arises from the recognition of what lies beneath visibility, an awareness that the environment extends far beyond what can be directly sensed. This pattern has been described in modern terms as thalassophobia, yet the label arrives long after the response itself has already taken shape within the body. The ocean is the origin of complex life, yet it is also the environment from which human physiology is most removed. Lungs that require air, eyes adapted to light, bones that cannot withstand extreme pressure, all define a boundary that cannot be crossed without assistance. Movement through this space depends on vessels, instruments, and layers of protection that separate the body from the surrounding conditions. Even with these tools, access remains partial, limited to narrow corridors within a much larger system. When something large moves within that system, briefly entering the zone where human observation is possible, the effect is immediate. Scale becomes difficult to anchor, and familiar reference points fall away. Encounters with known animals have produced this same recalibration, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet correction in perception. A whale passing beneath a small boat, a long, ribbon-like fish rising unexpectedly toward the surface, a massive form emerging and then disappearing again. Each instance alters the sense of proportion, placing the observer within a broader context. The response that follows is often described as fear, yet it carries information rather than confusion. It signals that the environment contains elements beyond immediate understanding, that caution is appropriate where knowledge is incomplete. In this way, the reaction aligns with the behavior observed among those who spend extended time within these waters, where adjustments are made not out of superstition, but out of accumulated experience. There is a distinction between fear that distorts and fear that clarifies. The former amplifies uncertainty into something unrecognizable, while the latter sharpens attention, guiding decisions in the absence of complete data. In the presence of the ocean's depth, it is the second form that tends to emerge, not as panic, but as a steady awareness that the visible surface is only a fraction of what exists. This awareness has practical consequences. It shapes how routes are chosen, how time is measured against daylight, how unfamiliar signs are interpreted. It also shapes the way stories persist, not as embellishments, but as frameworks for remembering where caution once proved necessary. Over time, these frameworks become part of the environment itself, as much a feature of the water as currents or temperature. Within this context, the figure that has been traced through earlier accounts does not stand apart from the response it evokes. It becomes one expression of a broader interaction between human perception and a space that resists full comprehension. Whether or not its exact form is ever confirmed, the reaction it produces remains consistent with the conditions that give rise to it. To move across the surface of the ocean is to pass over a depth that is largely unseen, a volume that extends far beyond direct experience. The mind registers this extension even when the eyes cannot, translating it into a form of awareness that is often described as unease, but functions as orientation. It places the observer within a larger system, one that operates according to rules not entirely accessible from above. In this sense, the response often labeled as fear becomes a form of alignment, a way of recognizing the scale and nature of the environment without requiring it to be fully revealed. Night settles over the gulf without announcement, the horizon dissolving into a continuous field where sky and water become indistinguishable. The surface appears calm, carrying no trace of the structure beneath it, no indication of the vast vertical distance that begins just below the hulls of the few vessels still moving across it. From above, there is only a faint undulation, a quiet shifting of reflected light, a surface that gives nothing away. This water has held its form across centuries, receiving the same winds, the same tides, the same slow rearrangement of currents that move unseen below. It is the same body that supported reed vessels guided by memory and observation, the same expanse later crossed by wooden hulls and recorded in careful script, the same place that drew attention for its density of life and the clarity of its shallows. Each layer of history rests on the same foundation, unchanged in its deeper structure, continuous beneath the surface variations of time. Far below, where depth becomes distance rather than direction, the environment resolves into a different set of conditions entirely. Temperature stabilizes near the edge of freezing, pressure builds beyond what unprotected tissue can withstand, and light, having diminished steadily, disappears altogether. Sound from above attenuates into silence, absorbed and scattered long before it can reach the lowest contours of the basin. The world that exists there is not an extension of the surface, but a separate domain, defined by constraints that remain constant over long spans of time. Within that domain, existence unfolds at a pace shaped by scarcity and stability. Movement is measured, energy conserved, interactions governed by gradients that are invisible from above. There is no need for speed beyond what is required, no excess beyond what can be sustained. The conditions themselves impose a rhythm, one that has persisted without interruption, independent of the events that have unfolded at the surface. An organism, adapted to such an environment, would carry that rhythm within it, shaped across years that extend beyond ordinary frames of reference. Growth would proceed slowly, responses calibrated to subtle changes in pressure, temperature, and the presence of prey. The passage of time would not be marked by seasons in the usual sense, but by cycles that occur within the water column, rising and falling with a regularity that does not depend on the surface world. There is a continuity in this arrangement that resists the boundaries often placed around it. The same depths that existed before written records remain present now, unchanged in their essential properties. The same gradients that guided earlier encounters continue to structure movement below. The water does not reset between generations. It accumulates, holding within it the conditions that have allowed certain patterns to persist. At the surface, observation remains brief, limited to moments when something from below enters the range of human perception. These moments pass quickly, leaving behind impressions that are difficult to fix in precise terms. What remains afterward is not a complete image, but a trace, an outline shaped by proximity and duration. Over time, these traces align in ways that suggest continuity, even as their source remains beyond direct reach. The depth itself imposes this separation. It creates a boundary that is not easily crossed, a distance that cannot be reduced without specialized effort and sustained attention. In its absence, the lower basin remains largely unobserved, its contents inferred through indirect means, its processes understood only in part. The surface carries on above it, largely unaffected, while the deeper system continues according to its own constraints. Within this structure, the question that has moved through earlier accounts does not resolve into a single form. It remains distributed across observations, embedded within the environment that produced them. The water that held those observations still exists, unchanged in its depth, unchanged in its capacity to contain what has not yet been fully seen. There is a steadiness in that persistence, a sense that the gulf continues to hold its deeper layers intact, regardless of how often its surface is crossed. The distance between what is visible and what remains below is not closing on its own. It waits for attention, for tools, for time, while continuing to sustain whatever moves within it, unseen but not absent. It begins and ends with a moment held just long enough to be remembered, a small vessel suspended on dark water, a shape rising where there should be only surface, a line cutting upward into view and then slipping back below without explanation. No name is attached to it at the time. There is only the recognition that something present has not been accounted for, something that does not fit cleanly into the boundaries of what is expected. From that moment, the record extends outward, carried across centuries, not as a single narrative, but as a series of observations that align without merging. Voices separated by distance and time arrive at similar descriptions, each grounded in direct experience, each limited by the same brief exposure to what appears and then withdraws. The continuity is not constructed afterward. It emerges gradually as patterns settle into place through repetition. Along the way, the framework used to interpret these observations has expanded. Geological processes have been traced, revealing the basin as part of a larger system still in motion. Biological principles have been examined, showing how size, lifespan, and behavior can shift under conditions that differ from those at the surface. Oral traditions have been considered alongside written records, not as competing accounts, but as parallel forms of knowledge shaped by different methods of attention. Each layer adds context without closing the question. The deeper the examination becomes, the more it reveals the extent to which the environment itself remains only partially understood. Depth, temperature, pressure, and the movement of life through the water column create a system that cannot be fully observed from above. What is known is distributed unevenly, concentrated near the surface, and thinning as distance increases. Within that structure, certainty does not accumulate in a straight line. It gathers in fragments, some well established, others provisional, all dependent on the reach of observation. When the available evidence is assembled, it forms a coherent outline, but not a complete image. There are edges that remain undefined, spaces where inference replaces direct confirmation. The most precise description that can be offered at this point is one that leaves those spaces intact. The contents of the deeper basin have not been surveyed with the consistency required to exclude the presence of large, rarely observed organisms, nor has any single explanation fully accounted for the range and consistency of the reported encounters. The question persists because the conditions that would allow it to be resolved have not yet been fully applied. This state is not unusual within the broader history of inquiry. There have been other instances where conclusions were drawn before sufficient data had been gathered, where absence of evidence was interpreted as evidence of absence, and where later discoveries required earlier assumptions to be revised. The pattern is not a flaw in reasoning, but a reflection of how knowledge advances, expanding outward from what is directly accessible. The gulf itself does not depend on these conclusions. It continues to operate according to processes that predate their formulation, maintaining gradients, currents, and ecological relationships that persist regardless of how they are described. Its deeper regions remain largely unchanged, defined by conditions that have held steady over long intervals, insulated from the variability of the surface. In that setting, whatever moves below does so without reference to observation or interpretation. Its existence, if present, is shaped by the same factors that govern all life in that environment, constrained by energy, pressure, and the distribution of prey. It does not require recognition in order to persist, nor does it alter its behavior in response to the narratives formed above. The question, then, remains situated within the boundary between what has been seen and what has not. It is held there by the limits of access, by the distance that separates surface from depth, and by the time required to bridge that distance with careful investigation. Until that process extends further, the outline remains incomplete. There is a steadiness in allowing that incompleteness to remain. It preserves the distinction between what is known and what is not yet known, keeping the two from being collapsed into a single, simplified conclusion. Within that distinction, the gulf retains its depth, both in a physical sense and in the scope of what it may contain, continuing to hold its unanswered questions without urgency or resolution.